Now, if you'd asked me, what is the greatest compliment Michael Jordan could pay you? It's not that I was a great deal maker. It's not that I invented Air Jordan. It's not that I was aggressive. The best compliment he could give me is that I helped him learn the business. Now, he's an extremely intelligent man. You know, he's the first true billionaire in sports.
David, thank you so much for having us. This Boardroom edition is in Bethesda, Maryland. We are in your home in Bethesda. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Delighted to be here.
This is a rare one for me because very few times can I say I have sat with an idol of mine. Being someone that hasn't been a professional athlete, but somebody that's paved the way for someone like myself, it's quite an honor to be here. I saw that when you were in the 4th grade, someone that was friends with you, I read, said that you said you wanted to be a sports agent in the 4th grade.
It's actually in the 5th grade, and this one student named Gregory Mallow wrote in my book that I should be a lawyer because I was a good arguer. I think that's a really good way to describe a lawyer, but for some reason that always stuck in my mind, and I always, from a young age, always wanted to be a lawyer.
That's really funny. I had a company in the 4th grade as well called Lawyer Kid, and very similar. I was told by my friends that I was a good arguer and that they all asked me to argue on behalf of them to their parents, so hence why I was the Lawyer Kid. So tell me a bit about the evolution of where you grew up, what role sports played in your life, and how that kind of took you on the path to being a good arguer into being the premier agent.
I grew up in Long Island in a town called Levittown. It was a town built in the late 40s for returning GIs who were coming home from World War II. And it was a very working class community. My dad was a butcher. Most of my friends' dads were skilled laborers. They were carpenters or steam fitters. And my mom was a teacher, very highly educated. She graduated college at 19 from Hunter College. She had 2 bachelor's degrees. She spoke 8 languages. And she was really my life mentor. She was extremely loving, but very demanding. And I went off to college at Syracuse in 1968. And the very first day of school, I met the 2-star basketball players who were on my floor in the dorm. And we became best friends to this day. And I had this very sort of romantic notion that when we all finished school as seniors, that they'd go pro and I'd represent them. And I realized by the time I was a senior, I realized what a lot of young agents don't realize today. I didn't have a clue what the business was. So he picked a guy and ended up in Europe, and I went off to law school. And in law school, here at GW in Washington, I got really serious and I started networking. Back then, in the early 70s, the business was in its infancy. And most of the people that did it, Rich, did it by themselves. And they all told me, if you're here in Washington, there's a guy who does sports named Donald Dell. I'd never heard of Donald Dell. He was a tennis guy. So I started to reach out to him, and I called him incessantly. And no matter how many times I called him, he was never available. And when he ran out of excuses, he finally gave me an interview, and he kept me waiting 3.5 hours. And I get in there, and he told me they weren't hiring people of my pedigree. You know, he went to Yale in Virginia, another went to Dartmouth in Virginia, and I was sort of like the black sheep in the family. So I said, look, I really want to do this. I'll go to work for free. Now that appealed to him. So the summer of my 2nd year in law school, I had a full-time job at the day at a really big Chicago firm here in town. And when I got done at 6 o'clock, I'd walk across the street and work from 6 to 11 for free all summer long. And he finally hired me a week after graduation. He's got like 20 Ferraris.
Who, MJ?
Yeah. You have no idea what those things cost. Some of them cost like $9 million.
Yeah.
Aren't they cool?
What was expected of an agent in the 80s and late 70s?
It was completely different. I mean, it was like the earth is flat kind of a difference.
Yeah.
And so what I did early on, I was a lawyer. I wrote every contract in the firm. I wrote all the endorsement contracts. I wrote all the NBA contracts. Now, I would take the NBA contract and cross the entire thing out and write like a 20-page addendum. And I came up with my own language, most of which is now in the collective bargaining agreement now.
Really?
All the language about guarantees. I was 25 years old.
That's
my
incredible.
starting salary was 13. Got a big raise to 16 the next year. I was making less than the secretaries. And I was working 120 hours a week, 7 days a week, 9 to 10. I was married. I didn't care. I was in
You were in heaven.
7th heaven.
Kind of talk me through that like next phase of your career, and obviously when as a childhood like basketball junkie, I started to understand who you were. So I was starting to see that you were the agent for all of my favorite players. And that started happening around 84, 85, 86.
My career really took off in 82. In 82, we represented James Worthy, who was the #1 pick in the draft. In 84, we represented Michael. Now, back then, it wasn't a great coup to sign. It was a great coup to get him. So Coach Smith at Carolina, John Thompson at Georgetown, Bobby Knight at Indiana, Pitino, Coach K, they were like the Godfathers. They completely controlled it. And they would tell you, if you ever bump into Michael's mother, don't tell me you were shopping in Wilmington, you're off the list. No contact whatsoever. And they'd invite you down for 1 hour to have an interview. And then there was no contact until they gave you the answer.
That was the standard throughout recruiting at that
and so
point?
that back then, and this will sound ancient, you could actually negotiate the rookie contracts.
Yep.
So, for example, in 1977, we had a player named Marcus Johnson from UCLA. He was the National Player of the Year. He was the 3rd pick in the draft by Milwaukee, and he made 30% more money than the player who went #1 to Milwaukee, named Kent Benson.
And that was your
30%.
negotiation?
We did that. So after that, Coach Smith, who was a math major, gave us all the clients. We got every guy at Carolina. We had Phil Ford, who was a National Player of the Year in 78,
Yep.
Dudley Bradley in 79, who went 13, Michael Corrin 80, who went 6 to the Nets, Al Wood, who went 4 to Atlanta in 81, and Worthy in 82, and then Michael in 84. So we got tons of players from Carolina, Duke, Indiana, Kansas, Georgetown. I mean, that was basically our clientele. And our clients on average, Rich, probably made 20% more than a comparable guy. And so we just kept getting more and more clients at a high level. I was building up the business. And so between 82 and 86, if I could just take that brief period of time, we had James Worthy, who was the 1st pick, got the largest shoe deal in the history of the NBA by 50%.
What was that deal?
New Balance, $1.2 million for 8 years.
$1.2 million over 8 years?
Mm-hmm. 150 a year. Magic was making 75. Kareem was making 100. Had Michael in 84. Boomer Esiason in football in 84. James Lofton in football in 84. Patrick in 85. Chris Dolman, who's the 4th all-time sacker in 85. And Johnny Dawkins, the National Player of the Year in 86. Now, if that was my whole career,
You would have been
I might have been
golden.
one of the top 5 agents, just in that 3
You
or 4.
are.
And we also signed John Thompson.
So the way the process worked at that time was you waited till the college basketball season ended. There was no conversations being had. There were no discussions with parents. There was no AAU to even pull upon back then. And you waited till the season was over and you went in and you pitched at the university. Let's start with North Carolina and give me the pitch and the process that went into having to present to Michael. What were you pitching Michael that you saw outside of getting a contract done and being able to be the best negotiator for a deal?
We basically pitched 3 services. We pitched contract negotiations, marketing, and managing their money. But I specialized in doing the contracts and doing the shoe deals. We were just selling our track record. And the coaches, Dean would never acknowledge that he picked the agent, but he did.
Yeah.
Sometimes the player wanted to go with you, and Coach Smith didn't think it was a good fit. And
Coach Smith would win out on
and
that?
he suggested to the parents that it wouldn't be a
Strongly.
it wouldn't be a good fit. But for a long period of time, we had all these top guys coming out of Carolina, Georgetown, and it was a very simple business meeting. I mean, you weren't selling servicing, you weren't selling what they call babysitting, you weren't selling hanging out in clubs and being their best friends. You were selling your competence. And we had a very, very strong track record. The numbers spoke for themselves. And so it was easy. What would happen, ironically, is that we meet other players from different schools that weren't quite as controlled as those 5 or 6.
Yeah.
And invariably, we wouldn't get them because the agents would say, oh, God, if you go with David, he's got James, he's got Michael, you're never going to see him. And they get nervous. And then 2 or 3 years later, they would call you. And they'd say, look, I don't need any attention. Will you please just make me some money? And the guys we got on the rebound that we didn't have out of school were 20 times easier to manage because they had seen sort of the other side. They're driving a Yugo, and now they're going to drive.
And they were basically coming and recruiting you now to come take them on.
They would just ask you, please,
Yes.
just please do the deal.
Did you think that Patrick was the bigger star that you maybe were bringing into your roster, or did you think that Michael was the one? And putting basketball aside, just in terms of presence, the enigma, all of it.
Well, I mean, coming out of college, Patrick was the dominant.
was
They were
the
in the
guy.
same class.
Yeah.
So Michael came out as a junior. Nobody knew how good Michael was going to be. In the Carolina system, he never averaged 20 points a game. The consensus by the GMs on Michael was they weren't sure if he was a 2 or 3. Wasn't that good of a shooter. They really had doubts that he, be 50% as good as he became. That's why he went number 3. You knew it was going to be exciting, but I think people felt he'd be more like Dominique Wilkins than the player he became. So it's hard to please people in the NBA. But I'll tell you a great story. So when Patrick was a junior, his mother died. And one day out of left field, John Thompson called me up. I just met him in '80. I was just getting to develop a relationship with him. And he said, what do you think of the idea of Patrick leaving school as a junior? I hadn't given it 1 second of thought.
And no one did
No
that.
one had ever come out of Georgetown ever. And I said, I don't think it's a good idea. And he said, why? And I said, well, I read in the Washington Post that he promised his mom he'd be the first person in his family to graduate from college, and his mother, Dorothy, died. And he said, that's the best you got? He said, for $1 million a year, he could get as much education as he needs. I said, well, that may be true, Coach, but, he's not even going to be the first pick in the draft. Houston has the first pick, and they're going to take the local guy, Olajuwon, from the University of Houston. Why do you want a franchise player to come out and not go number 1? They said, because he's going to make $1 million a year, like Ralph Sampson did. And I said, so we got into this intense discussion. And it was exactly backwards of what you would expect of a coach and an agent. Agent's telling the coach the player should go back to school. The coach is telling the agent,
That's a crazy
I don't want him to go
conversation
back
to think
to school.
about having now.
He didn't want the responsibility. He said, what if he gets hurt? I said, you buy him an insurance policy. So this went on for about 20 minutes. And I don't know how well you know John. John's like my hero in life. But when he gets strident, he was like cursing me out like a truck driver. As much as I respected him, there's only so much abuse I could take in one session. I said, do whatever the hell you want to do, but I'm going to tell you 3 things. Number 1, he's 21 years old. He's not going to get amnesia and forget how to play. Number 2, the money will never go away for a franchise player. And number 3, you can cover the risk of injury with insurance. But do whatever the hell you want. My advice is tell him to go back to school. So Patrick didn't want to come out. He went back. And in '85, when they changed the rules and they went from a coin flip from the 2 worst teams to the lottery. Of course, the Knicks won the lottery.
Yeah.
And the Knicks drafted him. And he signed for $3.2 million a year as a rookie. The highest contract in the history of the league was Jabbar, who made $2 million a year. So Patrick got 55% more money than the highest paid veteran in history. And in the process, I invented something called the early termination option. He had a 10-year deal, and he had the option to terminate at the end of the 6th year.
So say that again. That's standard now. So you created the early termination option?
I created a lot of things over my career because you're representing these superstar talents and you have to be creative. One of the frustrating things about being an agent today is that there's 0 creativity in structuring the deals. If you're representing LeBron or Kobe or Kevin, you're going to get the max and you want to decide, do you want payments over 12 months or 6 months? Do you want money up front, and do you want 4 years or 5 years? There's nothing to do. There's only 3 sentences. Unlike when I told you that I used to write the contracts.
Yeah.
So what happened was most of the agents didn't understand the collective bargaining agreement at all. They didn't know what a guaranteed contract meant. And so I defined what a guaranteed contract meant in my contracts. It said that the obligation of the team to pay the player is absolute as of the day of signing the contract and is not dependent on the performance or the availability of the player.
So this didn't exist before then? These contracts were all non-guaranteed?
No one knew what guaranteed meant. Now, interestingly, we used to have contracts with not only guaranteed, but guaranteed no-cut contracts. And so we did a contract in 1978 for Kermit Washington in my office. Red Auerbach said, what do you mean no cut? I can't cut him? I said, no. He said, well, if I guarantee the money, why can't I cut him? That's because if you cut him, he's going to lose the funding for the pension fund. That's why you have to keep him on the roster. And he said, well, if I fund the pension fund, can I get rid of the no cut? And we said, sure. So that was the first major change.
Oh my God.
But the contracts were very complicated back then.
And you charter it the rest of the year?
Yeah.
You have someone that books out your plane?
Yeah, the charter pays for the pilots. I got 2 full-time pilots. The charter pays for the pilots. It's great.
It's amazing.
You started to build what is the preeminent sports brand, if not cultural brand of all time, and Michael's brand. Tell me just how you started this process, how Michael communicated with you about what he wanted and what you wanted from him.
Just by way of background, from 1974, when I started as an unpaid intern, if you will, at ProServe, till 1984, those 10 years, I was the junior agent for 2 world-class tennis players who had their own shoes, their own rackets, their own line of clothes, Arthur Ashe and Stan Smith. We also represented Jimmy Connors, Ivan Lendl, Tracy Austin, all the tennis players. It was standard to have their own products.
Yeah.
Nobody had it in basketball. And Worthy's shoe deal was the groundbreaking deal. And Coach Smith said, David, we don't need you for the shoe deal. Puma's offered him $55,000. I said, well, Coach, just give me a chance. We may be able to get him more. He said, you think you can get a rookie more than $55,000? I said, well, give me a shot. We signed him for, $150,000 a year. But the marketing didn't exist at all. Yeah. I mean, think like Kareem didn't have his own shoe, Dr. J didn't have his own shoe, Bird and Magic didn't have their own shoe, and they weren't making any money. I mean, they were making very little money. Kareem was the highest paid player at $100,000 a year for shoes till Worthy came along. And so when Michael came, I actually came up with a marketing plan for him. I wouldn't say it was what he ended up having because there was no precedent.
Yeah.
But he starred the Olympics in front of an audience, let's say 1 billion people, and he dominated the Olympics.
This is right before he went pro, right, in '84?
Exactly.
Yep.
And it was like a man among boys watching him in the Olympics. I mean, Patrick was on the team, Chris Mullin was on the team, Vern Fleming, they had a really good team. He just dominated. And it astounded me because I had never seen that. You never saw that in college. Dean wouldn't let him dominate. So no one saw that raw, athleticism. And I wanted to try to do some different things. So my game plan was very simple. I sat down with his parents and him at Chapel Hill. And I said, we're going to market you as the all-American hero, the boy next door, 2-parent family, North Carolina, Olympic star. And so the first 3 deals I wanted to make were Coke, Chevy, and McDonald's. Doesn't get any more apple pie than that. So Nike was first. And the amusing thing to me about Michael and Nike, he didn't want to go. Didn't know anything about it, didn't like the shoes, didn't want to go. The shoe wasn't that great at the time, in '84. And Converse was the dominant brand. Converse had Dr. J, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, Bernard King, Isaiah Thomas. They had the official shoe of the Olympics. And Adidas had everybody else that mattered. And I thought that Nike was the hungriest for Michael, that they needed him the most, that they would do the most. The marketing plan I envisioned was 3 or 4 core companies, all American, that would promote his clean-cut image. And we got his parents involved in the commercials. And those are the first. Now, as you probably know, McDonald's is the largest seller in the world of Coca-Cola products. They have an inextricable relationship. So we had to integrate the deals. You can't go with Burger King. You got to figure out who matches up together. We thought the image was pretty consistent for those 3 companies, Coke, McDonald's, and Chevrolet. Chevy was just a local deal in Chicago, as was McDonald's. McDonald's first deal wasn't national. And we went to McDonald's, so we want you to sign Michael Jordan. It's based in Oak Brook, Illinois. He's in Northbrook, Illinois. And they said, well, gosh, how are we going to use a black basketball player? I said, what do you mean? Like, I go to McDonald's, see a lot of African-American people eating at McDonald's. So we signed a deal in 2 markets, Chicago and North Carolina. They each paid him $25,000 a year. And at the end of the second year, there was an option to go national. The woman who ran the North Carolina co-op didn't want to renew his deal at the end of the second year because she couldn't understand what on earth she could do to market Michael Jordan in the state of North Carolina. I think she got transferred to Afghanistan.
That sounds about right.
Oh, here they are. These are Ferraris.
Let me see. Oh my God.
Ferrari Jordans.
When did those come out?
I don't know. I just got them the other day.